At my sister's engagement dinner, everyone had a seat except me, so I walked away, not knowing that one small act of kindness would change my life forever. Every night I left my porch light on for a homeless man sleeping in the park. "You're wasting electricity," my wife complained. Then one morning, a limousine pulled into our driveway. A woman in pearls stepped out and asked for me. "That man was my father," she said. "His dying wish was about you." The black limousine pulled into my driveway at exactly 7:23 on a Thursday morning. I was standing at my kitchen window, coffee cup halfway to my lips, watching steam curl into the early light when the vehicle rolled to a stop where my pickup truck usually sat. Government plates, I thought at first. Then the driver stepped out, walked around to the rear passenger door, and opened it with the kind of practiced precision you only see in movies. A woman emerged wearing a charcoal business suit and a string of pearls that caught the sunrise like captured moonlight. She stood there for a moment, scanning my modest two-story colonial like she was appraising it for purchase. And then she looked directly at my window, directly at me. Our eyes met through the glass, and something in her expression made my stomach drop 3 floors. She knew me. I had never seen this woman in my life, but she knew me with a certainty that made my hands start shaking. The coffee cup clattered against the saucer. My wife Karen called from upstairs asking who was in the driveway at this hour. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't move because somehow, impossibly, I understood that this moment had been coming for 8 months. Ever since I started leaving my porch light on for an old man sleeping in Riverside Park, his name was Arthur. At least that's what he told me the first time we spoke. Though I would later learn that wasn't entirely true. I discovered him on a September evening 8 months before the limousine arrived, huddled on a bench near the duck pond with a torn army blanket wrapped around his shoulders. I walked through that park every night after dinner, a habit I'd developed to escape the growing tension in my house, the silences that had become louder than any argument. Karen and I had been married for 19 years, and somewhere around year 15, we'd stopped talking and started coexisting. The walks helped. The cool air, the sound of crickets. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other gave me something to focus on besides the emptiness waiting for me at home. That September night, the temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and the old man on the bench was shivering so hard I could hear his teeth chattering from 20 feet away. I'm Thomas Brennan, 52 years old, a high school history teacher for the past 26 years, and I'd like to think I'm the kind of person who notices when someone needs help. So I stopped walking and asked if he was okay. He looked up at me with eyes that held something I couldn't quite name. Intelligence, certainly clarity that seemed out of place given his circumstances. His beard was long and gray, his clothes were ragged, and he smelled like he hadn't showered in weeks. But when he spoke, his voice carried the refined cadence of someone who'd once occupied boardrooms, not park benches. "I'm fine," he said, which was obviously a lie. "Just resting." I asked if he had somewhere to go, somewhere warm. He smiled, and there was something heartbreaking in that smile, something that suggested he'd answered this question many times before. "I have the stars," he said, gesturing at the sky. "Best ceiling anyone could ask for." I stood there like an idiot, hands in my pockets, not sure what to do. I'd passed homeless people in the city plenty of times, always with that uncomfortable mix of guilt and avoidance that marks most suburban interactions with poverty. But this was different. This was my park, my neighborhood, my community. This old man was sleeping 50 yards from where children played soccer on Saturday mornings. I pulled out my wallet and offered him the $40 I had. He shook his head. "I don't need money, son, but I appreciate the thought." Then he turned away and pulled his blanket tighter, a clear dismissal. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Karen noticed my restlessness and asked what was wrong, but when I told her about the old man, she just sighed. "There's a shelter downtown," she said. "They have resources for people like that. You can't save everyone, Thomas." She was right. Of course I couldn't save everyone. But I kept thinking about those eyes, that voice, the way he'd refused my money, like accepting charity was somehow beneath him. The next evening, I walked through the park again. He was still there. Same bench, same blanket. I'd brought a thermos of hot soup and a spare jacket from my closet, one I hadn't worn in years. He accepted both with a nod that felt more like acknowledgement than gratitude. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. He asked what I did for a living. And when I told him I taught history, his face lit up. "The study of human triumph and failure," he said. "The only subject that truly matters." He quoted Thucydides from memory perfectly, and I found myself sitting down on the bench beside him, drawn into a conversation about the Peloponnesian War that lasted until the park lights flickered on. When I finally stood to leave, he called after me. "Thomas," he said, and hearing him use my name felt strangely intimate. "Thank you for seeing me. Most people look through me like I'm made of glass. I told him I'd see him tomorrow. He smiled that heartbreaking smile again and said, "If God wills it." That became our routine. Every evening after dinner, I'd walk to the park with something for Arthur. Food mostly, but also books, blankets, a small battery-powered radio so he could listen to the news. Karen noticed the pattern within a week. "You're spending a lot of time at that park," she said one night, not looking up from her phone. I explained about Arthur, about our conversations, about how he seemed different from the typical image of homelessness. She was skeptical. "He's probably a drunk," she said, "or mentally ill. You're wasting your time." But Arthur wasn't a drunk. He never touched alcohol, refused it when I offered. And while I'm no psychiatrist, his mind seemed sharper than most people I knew. He could discuss philosophy, economics, military history, art, music. He remembered details I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later. Whatever had put him on that park bench, it wasn't a lack of intelligence or capability. When I asked him directly one evening what had happened to him, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I made choices, Thomas. Choices that seemed right at the time, and then I made one choice that cost me everything." He wouldn't elaborate no matter how gently I pressed. By November, the nights had turned brutal, temperatures dropping into the 20s, frost coating the grass each morning like shattered glass. I worried about Arthur, constantly imagining him freezing to death on that bench while I slept in my warm bed. That's when I started leaving the porch light on. Our house sat at the edge of Riverside Park, separated from the duck pond by maybe 200 yards of trees. If Arthur looked toward our property, he could see that light glowing through the branches. "It's a beacon," I told him. "If you ever need help, if things get too cold, you come to that light. I'll be there." He studied my face with those penetrating eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you care what happens to an old vagrant?" I didn't have a good answer. I just knew that I did. "Because someone should," I finally said. He nodded slowly, and I thought I saw something glisten in the corner of his eye. "You're a rare man, Thomas Brennan. Rarer than you know." Karen noticed the porch light the next morning. "Why was that on all night?" she demanded. "Do you know how much electricity costs?" I explained about the signal for Arthur. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're leaving our light on for a homeless man, Thomas? This is getting ridiculous. You're obsessed with this person." The arguments escalated from there. Every night when I turned on the porch light, Karen would turn it off. Every night after she went to bed, I'd turn it back on. It became a silent war, a proxy battle for all the things we couldn't say to each other about our dying marriage. One December night, she confronted me directly. "This has to stop," she said, arms crossed, blocking the front door. "The neighbors are talking. Linda Ashworth asked me if we're having financial problems because she sees our light on all night. She thinks we can't afford to heat the house properly." I told her I didn't care what the neighbors thought. "Well, I do," Karen snapped. "I have to live in this community. I have to face these people at PTA meetings and book clubs, and you're making us look like fools chasing after some crazy homeless man who's probably dangerous." Arthur wasn't dangerous. I knew that with absolute certainty, but I couldn't convince Karen. Couldn't make her see what I saw when I looked at him. So we stopped talking about it, added it to the growing list of topics we avoided, and the Cold War over the porch light continued through the winter. In January, Arthur got sick. I found him one evening hunched over on the bench, coughing so hard his whole body shook with each spasm. His forehead was burning when I touched it, and his breathing had a wet, rattling quality that terrified me. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said. He shook his head violently. "No hospitals, no authorities. They'll put me in the system, and I can't." He broke off, coughing again. "I can't be found, Thomas. Not yet. There's something I need to do first." I didn't understand what he meant, but his desperation was impossible to ignore. I made a decision that probably broke several laws. I called my neighbor, Dr. Franklin Webb, a retired physician who'd spent 30 years as a pulmonologist at St. Mary's Hospital. Frank owed me a favor from when I'd helped his son prepare for the AP history exam. I explained the situation, and after some hesitation, he agreed to come to the park. What Frank found wasn't good. Pneumonia advanced, both lungs. Arthur needed antibiotics, rest, and warmth, or he would die within days. "He should be hospitalized," Frank told me privately. "I can prescribe the medication, but without proper care, his chances are he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to." I did something then that I still can't fully explain. I brought Arthur to my house, not into the main building, but into the small guest cottage in our backyard, the one Karen had been trying to convert into a rental property for extra income. I set him up with blankets, a space heater, the medication Frank had prescribed, and a promise that I would check on him every few hours. Karen was visiting her sister in Connecticut that weekend, so I had 2 days before she returned. 2 days to save a man's life. Arthur was delirious with fever for the first 36 hours. He mumbled in his sleep fragments of conversations with people who weren't there. He kept saying a name over and over. Eleanor. Sometimes it sounded like pleading, other times like apology. Just once, he said it like a prayer. When his fever finally broke on the second morning, he opened his eyes and found me sitting beside his bed with a bowl of soup. Thomas, he whispered, "You shouldn't have done this." If they find out, I asked who would find out. What was he hiding from? But he just closed his eyes and turned away. "Some secrets are too heavy to share," he said. "They'd only drag you down with me." Karen came home that afternoon and discovered everything. The explosion was nuclear. She stood in the cottage doorway staring at Arthur in the bed, and then she turned on me with a fury I'd never seen in 19 years of marriage. "Have you lost your mind?" she screamed. "You brought a stranger into our home, a homeless man, while I was gone." I tried to explain about the pneumonia, about the desperation, about how he would have died otherwise. "She didn't care. I want him out," she said. "Today now, or I'm calling the police." Arthur spoke from the bed, his voice weak but calm. "She's right, Thomas. I shouldn't be here. I've put you in an impossible position." He started to rise, and I watched a man who could barely stand try to put on his tattered coat with hands that trembled like leaves in a storm. Something snapped in me. "No," I said to Karen. "He stays until he's well enough to leave safely." Her eyes went wide. "Excuse me," I repeated myself. Arthur stayed. Karen packed a bag that night and went to stay with her sister again. And that was the beginning of the end of my marriage. Over the next 2 weeks, as Arthur recovered, I learned pieces of his story. Not the whole thing, never the whole thing, but fragments that hinted at a life vastly different from the one he was living now. He'd been a businessman, he admitted one afternoon. Very successful at one point. He'd had a family, a wife named Eleanor, a daughter whose name he could never bring himself to speak. "What happened?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said pride, stubbornness, the conviction that I was right when I was catastrophically wrong. He explained that he'd made enemies in business, powerful enemies who'd eventually destroyed him. They'd taken his company, his reputation, his wealth. But the worst part, he said, his voice cracking, was that I let them take my family too. Eleanor tried to stand by me, but I pushed her away. I was so consumed with revenge, with fighting back, that I didn't see what I was losing until it was gone. He'd spent years in prison, he admitted, for financial crimes he insisted he didn't commit. When he got out, Eleanor had died, and his daughter wanted nothing to do with him. He'd been on the streets ever since, moving from city to city, never staying long enough to be found by the people who still wanted to hurt him. Karen filed for divorce in February. She cited irreconcilable differences, but we both knew the real reasons were much more complicated. The porch light, the homeless man, the guest cottage incident, these were symptoms, not causes. The cause was 18 years of slowly growing apart until we became strangers sharing a bed. The papers were served on a Wednesday afternoon, and I signed them without argument. Arthur had recovered by then and returned to his park bench, though I'd convinced him to accept a small tent and proper cold weather sleeping gear. Our evening conversations continued deeper now, more honest. He knew about the divorce, and I could see it weighed on him. "I've cost you your marriage," he said one night. I told him the marriage had been over long before he arrived. He was just the catalyst that finally triggered the inevitable. "Still," he said, "I should leave. Find another town, another park. My presence here only brings you trouble." I asked him not to go. I'd grown to depend on our conversations, on his perspective, on the strange comfort of knowing someone understood me. "Stay," I said, "at least until spring." He studied my face in the dim light. "You're too kind for your own good, Thomas Brennan. It's going to get you in trouble someday." He said it like a warning, like he knew something I didn't. Spring arrived in late March, warming the air and melting the last stubborn patches of snow. Arthur seemed healthier, stronger, more at peace than I'd seen him since we met. He started talking about his daughter more openly, though he still wouldn't say her name. "She was brilliant," he'd say. "Even as a child, she understood things that took me decades to learn." He showed me a photograph once worn and creased from being carried for years. A young woman in a graduation gown, dark hair, serious eyes, a smile that seemed to be hiding something. Princeton, Arthur said proudly, top of her class. She went on to build something extraordinary, something that helped thousands of people. He wouldn't tell me what she'd built or who she'd become. "It's safer for you not to know," he said. "The less you know, the less danger you're in." I thought he was being paranoid, melodramatic. I would later learn he was being cautious. In April, Arthur's health declined again. This time, it wasn't pneumonia. It was something in his abdomen, a pain that grew steadily worse until he could barely eat. I called Dr. Frank Webb again, and after examining Arthur, Frank pulled me aside with a grave expression. He needs imaging, Frank said. CT scan at minimum. This could be his appendix, his gallbladder, or he paused. Or it could be something much more serious. I convinced Arthur to let me take him to the hospital just for tests. No names, he insisted. I'll give them a false name, and you can't be associated with me officially, Thomas. You have to promise. I promised, though. I didn't understand why it mattered so much. The hospital visit revealed what Frank had feared. Pancreatic cancer stage 4 metastasized. The oncologist, Dr. Patricia Coleman, gave Arthur 6 months at most, probably less. Arthur took the news with an eerie calm, like he'd been expecting it all along. Well, he said as I drove him back to the park, I suppose I should have made that phone call sooner. I asked what phone call he meant. He just shook his head and stared out the window at the passing trees. The next morning, I found Arthur at his bench with a cell phone pressed to his ear, an ancient flip phone I'd never seen before. He was crying, speaking so softly I couldn't hear the words when he finished. He sat motionless for a long time, the phone clutched in both hands like a lifeline. I approached slowly, sat down beside him, waited. I called her, he said finally. My daughter, first time in 11 years. His voice broke on the last word. 11 years, Thomas. She was 31 when I went to prison. She's 42 now. I've missed her entire adult life. I asked what she'd said. Arthur wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She cried, he said. Just cried and cried. Couldn't speak for the longest time. Then she said she'd been searching for me. Hired private investigators, contacted shelters across the country. She never believed I was guilty. Thomas never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Hope she's coming to see me next week. She's flying in from California. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'll finally get to hold my daughter again. But Arthur didn't have until next week. 3 days later, I arrived at the park for our evening conversation and found his tent collapsed, his belongings scattered, and no sign of him anywhere. I searched for hours, calling his name, checking every corner of Riverside Park. Nothing. I was about to call the police when my phone rang. Dr. Frank Webb. Thomas, you need to come to St. Mary's. He said, your friend Arthur was brought in by ambulance this afternoon. He collapsed in front of the grocery store on Main Street. I broke every speed limit getting there. Frank met me in the hospital lobby, his expression telling me everything I needed to know before he spoke. His liver failed, Frank said. The cancer spread faster than anyone anticipated. He's conscious, but barely. They've made him comfortable, but he didn't finish. He didn't need to. I ran to Arthur's room and found him lying in the bed, smaller than I'd ever seen him. Wires and tubes connecting him to machines that beeped with clinical indifference. His eyes were closed, but they opened when I took his hand, Thomas. He breathed. I was hoping you'd come. I sat with him through the night. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in memories I couldn't follow. Once he grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me close. Listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. I need you to understand something. Everything I have, everything I was, I destroyed through my own arrogance. But you saved me, Thomas. Not just physically, you saved my soul. You showed me that kindness still exists, that strangers can be saints, that it's never too late for grace. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't a saint. I was just a divorced high school teacher who couldn't stand seeing an old man freeze to death. Arthur seemed to read my thoughts. Don't diminish what you did, he said. You saw a human being when everyone else saw garbage to be avoided. You left your light on so I'd know someone cared. Do you have any idea what that meant to me, Thomas? That light. He closed his eyes, exhausted from the effort of speaking. It meant I wasn't alone in the dark. His daughter arrived at 6:17 the next morning. I had dozed off in the chair beside Arthur's bed, and the sound of heels clicking on linoleum jolted me awake. She stood in the doorway, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair and serious eyes, exactly like the photograph Arthur had shown me. But the photograph hadn't prepared me for the intensity of her presence, the quiet authority she radiated like heat from a flame. She wore a charcoal suit and a string of pearls, and behind her stood 2 men in dark suits, who I would later learn were her attorneys. She walked past me without a glance, went straight to her father's bed, took his hand, and said a single word. Daddy. Arthur's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he seemed confused, lost between dreams and waking. Then he saw her face, and something extraordinary happened. The machines monitoring his vitals suddenly showed improvement. His blood pressure stabilized, his heart rate strengthened. It was as if her presence had literally given him new life. Eleanor, he whispered, using her name for the first time in all our months of conversation. You came. You really came. I realized then that she'd been named for her mother, the wife Arthur had lost. I stood to leave to give them privacy, but Eleanor stopped me with a hand on my arm. You're Thomas, she said. It wasn't a question. My father has told me about you. She looked at me with those serious eyes, and I felt like I was being weighed on some invisible scale. He's been writing me letters for months, she continued. Long letters about a man who feeds the homeless, who leaves his light on through the night, who risked his marriage to save a stranger's life. She glanced at her father, then back at me. He says, you're the reason he finally had the courage to call me. Says, your kindness made him believe he deserved forgiveness. Arthur spoke from the bed, his voice weak but clear. I was ready to die alone, Eleanor, ready to disappear and let the cancer take me in some anonymous alley. But Thomas kept showing up, kept treating me like I mattered. Made me think maybe, just maybe I hadn't ruined everything beyond repair. Eleanor's eyes were wet. She blinked rapidly, composing herself with visible effort. We have so much time to make up for, she said to her father. So much I need to tell you about the foundation, about the work we're doing in your name. Arthur squeezed her hand. Later, sweetheart. Right now I just want to look at you. He turned his head toward me. Thomas, this is my daughter, Eleanor Ashworth. She runs the Ashworth Foundation for Social Justice. 300 employees, 15 countries, doing more good in a day than I did in my entire career. The name hit me like a physical blow. Ashworth. I knew that name. Everyone in America knew that name. The Ashworth Foundation had been in the news constantly over the past decade. Started by an anonymous donor, it funded everything from homeless shelters to legal aid clinics to food banks. It had helped pass legislation protecting workers' rights, funded investigative journalism that brought down corrupt politicians, provided scholarships to tens of thousands of disadvantaged students. Eleanor Ashworth was regularly named among the most influential philanthropists in the country. Forbes had put her on their cover twice. She'd testified before Congress, and her father was the homeless man I'd been feeding soup to in Riverside Park. My mind struggled to make sense of it. If Eleanor had all this wealth and influence, why had Arthur been living on the streets? Why hadn't she helped him years ago, as if reading my thoughts? Eleanor explained. My father wouldn't let me help, she said quietly. When he got out of prison, I tried everything. Sent people to find him, offered him money, begged him to come live with me, but he refused. Said he needed to atone for what he'd done, for how he'd treated my mother, for pushing us away when we needed him most. She looked at Arthur with a mixture of love and exasperation. He's the most stubborn man I've ever known. Arthur died 3 days later with Eleanor holding one hand and me holding the other. His last words were to me, "The light, Thomas. Keep the light on. There are others out there in the dark." Then he closed his eyes, exhaled softly, and was gone. The machines flatlined. Nurses rushed in. Eleanor sobbed against my shoulder, and I stood there in shock, unable to fully grasp that the old man I'd come to love like a father was no longer in the world. The funeral was private, just Eleanor, a handful of her father's old friends from before his downfall, and me. I learned more about Arthur's life from the eulogies. His real name was Arthur Ashworth II, and he'd built one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. He'd been worth nearly $500 million at his peak. His enemies had destroyed him through fraud and deception, framing him for crimes they themselves had committed. He'd spent 8 years in prison, and by the time he was exonerated through new evidence, his wife had died of cancer and his empire was gone. He'd spent the next 11 years punishing himself, refusing his daughter's help, living on the margins of society as a form of penance until he met me. 1 week after the funeral, the limousine pulled into my driveway. Eleanor emerged, pearls gleaming in the morning light, and asked to speak with me inside. We sat at my kitchen table, two people who'd become connected through an old man's final months of life, and she handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter in Arthur's handwriting, dated 2 days before his death. Dearest Thomas, it began, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that the months I spent in your company were the happiest I've known since losing Eleanor's mother. You showed me that kindness exists without conditions, that generosity can be its own reward, that one person's compassion can illuminate the darkest night. I have asked my daughter to do something for you in my memory. Please accept it not as payment for what you did, but as acknowledgement of who you are. You are a good man, Thomas Brennan. The world needs more people like you. Keep the light on. With eternal gratitude, Arthur. I looked up at Eleanor, confused about what gift he could mean. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were legal documents, foundation letterheads, and a check that made my breath catch in my throat. My father left specific instructions in his will, Eleanor said. He established a trust fund in your name with an initial endowment of $5 million. The fund exists to continue the work you started with, him, feeding the homeless, providing shelter, keeping lights on in the darkness. I couldn't speak. $5 million for leaving my porch light on, for making soup and having conversations. It was absurd, impossible, overwhelming. Eleanor smiled for the first time since I'd met her. He also asked that you join the Ashworth Foundation's board of directors. We're launching a new initiative called the Beacon Project, named after the light you kept on for him. It will fund housing and support services for homeless individuals across the country. My father wanted you to lead it. I told her I was just a high school teacher. I didn't know anything about running charitable programs or managing millions of dollars. She reached across the table and took my hand. You know how to see people, she said. You know how to make someone feel human when the world has discarded them. That's rarer and more valuable than any business degree. I joined the Foundation's board. The Beacon Project launched 6 months later and has since helped over 30,000 people transition from homelessness to stable housing. I retired from teaching and now work full-time for the organization Arthur's daughter built in his memory. But the most meaningful part of my new life isn't the foundation work. It's what I do every night when darkness falls. I drive to parks and underpasses and bus stations across the city. I bring food, blankets, conversation. I sit with people who've been invisible for so long, they've forgotten what it feels like to be seen. And I tell them about Arthur, about a man who lost everything and found redemption through a stranger's kindness. About how one small gesture can change a life forever. Karen remarried last year, a nice man she met at church. We're actually friends now, something neither of us expected. She told me recently that she understands what I was doing with Arthur, even if she couldn't support it at the time. You were looking for something, she said. Something I couldn't give you. I'm glad you found it. I think she's right. I was looking for purpose, for meaning, for a reason to believe that one person's actions could matter in a world that often seems indifferent to suffering. The porch light at my house is still on every night. Different house now, closer to the Foundation's headquarters, but the same light. Eleanor visits every few months, and we always sit on the porch together watching that light glow against the darkness, talking about her father. She told me something last visit that I think about constantly. Daddy kept a journal during his time on the street, she said. I found it in his belongings after he died. There's an entry from the night you first left your light on for him. He wrote, "Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, I feel like someone knows I exist. There's a man in the house at the edge of the park who's left his porch light on, and I can see it from my bench. It's probably nothing. Probably forgot to turn it off. But I choose to believe it's for me. I choose to believe someone out there cares whether I freeze tonight. And that belief, fragile as it might be, is enough to keep me alive until morning." Eleanor had tears in her eyes when she finished reading. So did I. That's the thing about small kindnesses. You never know when the light you leave on is the only thing standing between someone and complete darkness. Arthur's story spread eventually. A journalist named Victoria Callahan from the New York Times heard about the Beacon Project and wanted to write a feature on its origins. I was hesitant at first, worried about the attention, but Eleanor convinced me that Arthur would have wanted people to know. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, complete with photographs of Arthur from both his business days and his time on the streets. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the foundation. Other organizations reached out wanting to partner. Politicians who'd previously ignored homelessness suddenly wanted to be photographed visiting our shelters. But the response that mattered most came from ordinary people. Thousands of emails and letters from individuals who'd read the article and been inspired to do something. A woman in Kansas who started leaving sandwiches at a park bench. A family in Florida who invited a homeless veteran to their Thanksgiving dinner. A teenager in Oregon who organized a blanket drive at his school. Small acts of kindness rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Arthur's light still shining. I'm writing this story because Arthur asked me to. In one of his letters to Eleanor, discovered after his death, he requested that his journey be shared with the world, not for glory or recognition, but as a testament to the power of human compassion. Tell them about Thomas, he wrote. Tell them that kindness isn't weakness, that generosity isn't naivety, that seeing the humanity in strangers is the most courageous act any of us can perform. He wanted people to understand that homelessness isn't a character flaw. It's often the result of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Bad luck, mental illness, addiction, family dysfunction, economic collapse. The people living on our streets are human beings with stories, histories, hopes that have been crushed by forces they couldn't fight. All they need is for someone to see them, to acknowledge their existence, to leave a light on in the darkness. The last thing I want to share is something Eleanor told me at Arthur's grave on the 1-year anniversary of his death. We brought flowers, red roses that had been Eleanor's mother's favorite, and we stood together in the soft spring rain looking at the headstone that read simply Arthur Ashworth II, beloved father, 1945 to 2024. He found his way home. Eleanor turned to me with those serious eyes that reminded me so much of her father. You saved him, Thomas, she said. Not from death, no one could have done that, but from dying alone, unloved, unforgiven. You gave him something to hope for. You made him believe he still deserved grace. I told her I hadn't done anything special. I'd just been kind. She shook her head. There's nothing just about kindness. She said, kindness is revolution. It's rebellion against a world that tells us to look away, to protect ourselves, to harden our hearts. Every time you choose to be kind, you're voting for the world you want to live in. She took my hand and squeezed it. My father voted for that world when he called me, and you're the reason he cast that vote. We stood there in the rain, two people bound by an old man's final gift of connection. And I thought about all the lights I'd seen go dark over my lifetime, all the moments I'd looked away, all the chances I'd missed to make a difference. And I made a promise to myself standing at Arthur's grave that I would never miss another chance, that I would leave every light on, that I would see every person who crossed my path, that I would be the kind of man Arthur believed I could be. That was 5 years ago. The Beacon Project has expanded to 40 cities. We've served over 200,000 people. Eleanor and I remain close friends, bound by our shared love for a stubborn, broken, beautiful man who taught us both what it means to never give up on redemption. I still walk through Riverside Park every evening, though Arthur's bench has been replaced by a small memorial garden now. There's a plaque with his name, a few flowers, and a perpetual light that never goes out. People leave notes there sometimes. Prayers for the homeless, promises to do better. Thank yous to a man most of them never met. And every night when darkness falls, I stand at my window and look out at the porch light glowing against the shadows. I think about Arthur, about his letters, about the way he smiled when I brought him soup, about the way he cried when he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 11 years. I think about all the Arthurs out there huddled on benches and in doorways, waiting for someone to see them. And I make the same prayer I've made every night for 5 years. Let my light reach someone who needs it. Let my kindness matter. Let me be for someone else what I was lucky enough to be for Arthur, a beacon in the dark. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Arthur's story isn't unique. There are millions of people living on our streets, each with their own history, their own heartbreak, their own hope that someone will notice them before it's too late. You don't have to start a foundation or donate millions of dollars. Just leave a light on, offer a sandwich, say hello. See the human being inside the circumstances. That's all Arthur ever wanted. That's all any of us want, really. To be seen, to be known, to matter to someone. So go be that someone. Find your Arthur. And when you do, remember that the life you save might also be your own. Because in helping Arthur, I finally understood what I'd been missing all those years. Not adventure or excitement or purpose, just connection. Simple human connection. The kind that happens when you see someone suffering and you choose not to look away. Arthur gave me that. His daughter gave me a way to share it with the world. And now I'm giving it to you. Leave the light on. Someone out there is counting on it. Thanks for watching till the end.